Hello, I'm Claudio Brinciano, your host today at our next podcast. What we are doing today is to draw a parallel between the German system regulating Kurzarbeit and the recently enforced Romanian legislation introduced this year. And we want to better understand the benefits of this project and what to expect in terms of long-term impact and possible interpretations when law is unclear. Our guests today are two partners specializing in labor law with Bulboaca and Associates, Ms. Andrada Bulgaru, and Ashurst, Germany, Mr. Andreas Mauroschat. Thank you for joining me. Andreas, can you tell us a few words about the evolution of Kurzarbeit in Germany and the current form in the context of COVID-19?
Sure, Claudio, my pleasure. Kurzarbeit, let's stay with the German term for it. For our podcast, it's easy reference. So Kurzarbeit is quite an actually historical established concept in Germany. The pioneering legal acts have been introduced more than 100 years ago. So in 1910, our Potash Act provided that workers which had their factories shut down because our government back in the days had introduced production quotas for potash and fertilizers, and that resulted in factory shutdowns. And the government, as sort of a compensation for those shutdowns, paid benefits to the workers. So this 1910 Act is a great example for the crisis situations, which we also see today, and which back in the day already brought this solution of Kurzarbeit about. So over the years, in the 1920s, we had several acts which, step by step came closer to our current system. And actually, in 1927, the act at the time is pretty much identical to what we see today. So the principle has been there for a long time. And over the 60s, 1960s, the Kurzarbeit has become sort of a generally accepted instrument to mitigate crisis impact, like the oil crisis and other situations where we have seen significant numbers of short-time workers in Germany. Obviously now, in 2020, the mother of all crises, Corona and COVID have hit the world, and in Germany that has reduced in also, of course, a significant impact on economy. And our usual tool of Kurzarbeit was sort of the government decided we needed a bit of a polish to the tool, so they introduced some simplifications and some enhancements to the benefits of Kurzarbeit in the beginning of 2020. And that resulted, of course, in a massive use of the tool up to the record high, the peak of about 7 million employees in Kurzarbeit in May 2020. So very quickly, in a nutshell, what were the enhancements we decided to introduce to fight the COVID impact? We reduced the number of employees to be affected or who had to be affected for an employer to be eligible. So it's 10% of the workforce rather than 33%, which was the requirement before. There were some less strict requirements on work time accounts, so employers would no longer be required to build up a negative working time account where there is a flexible and work time scheme in a company, which makes a huge difference because you know that sometimes there are significant months and months of employment stored on work time accounts. And employees sometimes obviously want to store those working times for whatever studies or so. So it makes a huge impact in practice that you can keep those work time accounts. The Social Security contributions are now paid fully by the Federal Labor Agency, and the amount of the benefits has increased if the Kurzarbeit takes longer, which it did in many industries due to COVID. So as of the 4th month, the benefit was 70 or 77% if you have children. And after the 7 months, this goes up to 80 or 87% of the last net salary. I think this is sort of the last level of evolution of Kurzarbeit, which we are seeing currently as a corona result. So that was a short walk through the history, Claudio.
It is useful to see this good practice from Germany, Andreas, and thank you for this. Andrada, what are the main issues Kurzarbeit has raised so far in Romania?
Even if considered a salutary solution, Kurzarbeit, besides the eligibility conditions, imposes a series of post or during application restrictions, such as non-performance of overtime, non-performance of any collective layoffs, or conclusion of new employment agreements, or even granting of bonuses to the management of the company during the relevant reference period. The granting of bonuses to the management of the company is one of the interdictions that raises a series of questions, as the law is silent when it comes to explaining what the exact management structure of the company means. A reasonable interpretation would be that the management of the company consists of the members of its board, with whom, of course, labor agreements are in place, or the top management of the company, basically the persons who are usually granted with consistent performance bonuses. As the relevant classification of occupations in Romania contains many director or manager positions, especially in large companies, lack of relevant provisions doubled by the novelty of the concept determine many employers to be very cautious as they extend the interpretation also to low-level managers, and for that matter, to all employees, at a certain point in order to avoid any discriminations. Another issue that arises from this interdiction, respectively the interdiction of not granting bonuses to the management members, arises from the fact that it envisages only the period during which Kurzarbeit is applied. One could interpret that only the granting of bonuses is put on hold, and not the reference period as a whole, and could argue that only the payment of such bonuses corresponding to the respective period is delayed. This is, however, an interpretation that might trigger the eventual reimbursement of the amounts granted by the state. That is because the purpose of the law is to help both the employer, whose activity and needs have been reduced, and the employees to overcome the crisis, of course, with external help. The parameters of the labor relationship change, and I don't think that one could justify sharing the cost of the employees under extraordinary conditions with the help of the state, while making, on the other hand, expenses with the payment of big bonuses. Another important issue regards one of the conditions to be met, namely the reduction of the daily, weekly, or monthly work duration by 50% at the most for at least 5 days. The reference to the daily, weekly, or monthly parameter and the elimination of the condition for the 5 days to be consecutive has been recently introduced in order to eliminate the previous legal constraint that referred only to the reduction of the work duration by 50%, and to also allow a more flexible approach of the program. Even if the authorities interpreted the law by its spirit, as it should, in fact, now it's very clear that Kurzarbeit can take the form of reduced working hours combined with full working hours, or alternative working and non-working periods, provided that the 5 days and the 50% reduction, both these conditions are observed. Last week brought, as you may know, several other changes in the relevant legal framework, some of them continuing not to make the employer's life easy. I'm referring now to the fact that in order to benefit from the state support, employers will need to conclude an agreement with the trade union representative or with the employee's representative, agreement that reflects the percentage of the employees affected by Kurzarbeit. This provision contravenes the same legal text that gives exclusive prerogatives to the employer when it comes to the reduction of the work duration and its application at the company level. Moreover, while the emergency government ordinance number 211 of early last week provided that the work duration needs to be reduced by 80% at the most, the law number 282 of 9th of December provided for the same aforementioned 50%. It is quite clear that we have a long way to go until, from a legal and practical perspective, the program will become an easy-to-go-to instrument.
Andreas, do you have similar constraints in Germany under Kurzarbeit? Does the program also involve entire days in which the employee does not perform work at all? How about the granting of bonuses or other kinds of benefits?
Yeah, I mean, listening to Andrada, I have to say we do have similar conditions. I mean, as I guess Andrada perfectly well put it, that there is an interest of the state to avoid that Kurzarbeit is used, that the Kurzarbeit benefits are abused. And I guess we need to make sure, the state needs to make sure that benefits are paid only if the company really experiences an inevitable significant loss of work, and if we can reach the target, which is to prevent dismissal. So that's the sort of the guardrails. Let's quickly touch on the bonuses and other benefits first. So we had the same political discussion, can you subsidize a company which pays big money in bonuses to its employees? We even had the discussion, BMW had thousands of employees in Kurzarbeit, but nevertheless they had a record dividend payment this year. And that also, of course, gives some people a bit of a bad taste to subsidies which at the same time result in benefits being paid. So for the bonuses, leaving aside politics for a moment, one-off benefit payments are permitted. So everything like Christmas bonuses and extra vacation money, they're all permitted. They must even be paid and would not reduce the amount of Kurzarbeitergeld. Annual performance bonuses are not prohibited, regardless of the initiative I mentioned. Eventually, it was decided not to prohibit them. So they can be made. It's more the other way around. The question is for employers, can we reduce bonuses now as a result of Kurzarbeit? And that will typically be the case where the bonus depends on the number of working hours. So even, an employee cannot argue, it wasn't my fault. You introduced Kurzarbeit, so you have to pay me the bonus. That won't hold. In my opinion, it's these type of bonuses, depending on working hours, will be reduced. The same applies to company targets, where Obviously, many companies using Kurzarbeit have had their earnings impacted as well, and other company targets. So that will result in a reduction of performance bonuses as well. It's a bit different for personal targets. So where an employee had to achieve certain sales numbers or client contact numbers, and that he couldn't do that due to Kurzarbeit, that would be considered shifting the risk, the economic risk of a business to the employee. And in those cases, it's quite possible that employees could claim a bonus regardless of Kurzarbeit and not having achieved personal targets. So it's a bit the other way round as the issue which Andrada described to us. I just want to quickly mention that we also had a tax-free bonus privilege for payments up to 1,500 euros, so not massive, but at least that amount could be paid tax-free, completely tax-free in 2020. Mainly, of course, that was aimed at employees in the health, in hospitals and healthcare. So, conscious of time, there are a couple other relevant conditions which Andrada touched on, which are similar to what we have in Germany. The dismissals, so redundancies and dismissals for other reasons, are generally not prohibited. But if you want to make a redundancy as an employer, you have to prove that you have other reasons than just simply the impact due to the crisis. The reasons which made you eligible for Kurzarbeit, those reasons, you can't use the same reasons to then lay off people. So you have to then say, as a result of COVID, we decided to restructure, Department A, or to close down the factory in B. Those would be sort of additional measures, and you would of course not be restricted in doing that. Once you fire an employee, of course, at that point in time, there is no more Kurzarbeit entitlement. On the other hand, you are still permitted to hire new employees if you have a reason for that. Of course, you can't put half of your workforce on Kurzarbeit and hire lots of new people with the money you saved. That's not permitted, but you can replace a specialist, for example, who goes away and you need to replace him. You just have to notify the Federal Labor Agency. And finally, the working time, and your question, Claudio, as to whole days. It's a fairly simple concept. We look at the working time for each month. Within the days or so, it's the employer is flexible, but the employer has to submit timesheets for each employee for each month when they apply for the Kurzarbeit money at the end of the month. So you may know that the concept in Germany is the employer pays the full salary and then submits an application for reimbursement to the agency. And it's very important then, of course, to document that seen over the month, the employee has worked only the number of working hours for which Kurzarbeitgeld is paid. So it could be Kurzarbeit 0, so no hours worked, or it could be Kurzarbeit 50% of the normal working hours worked. And you can't exceed the number of hours worked unless there is really an exceptional case. And just to quickly mention at this stage, we'll address it later, but exceeding the number of official working hours is one of the most significant reasons and cases and examples for fraud in connection with Kurzarbeit.
We know also that the unemployment rate in Germany decreased during the previous crisis with the help of this program. How do the things stand or seem to look like now, in your opinion, Andreas? The German companies seem to present a lowering appetite for this program now. Why do you think that we face this reality?
I mean, generally, I guess the impact of the corona pandemic was and still is massive. So our GDP for 2020 will decrease by 0.1% projected rate. So we are officially in a recession. The whole story is obviously that in 2021 it will likely increase, or is projected to increase, by about 1.7%. So we may be on track next year again already. But the surprising fact is that the recession hasn't really reflected in the unemployment rate so far. So in October 2020, our unemployment rate has further decreased. We are now at 6%. Compared to 5% in 2019, and for example 6.4 in 2015. So it's sort of in line with what you would expect, with a marginal increase potentially. And for 2021, we have a projection of 4.8%. So I guess you can say there is an obvious positive impact of Kurzarbeit and other government aid programs on the employment rate. What we see is exactly what you stated, Claudio. The number of companies under Kurzarbeit has continuously decreased since the peak in May. We had about 7 million employees in Kurzarbeit in May, and we're down to about 3.3 million now for October. So it has halved. But what we see, and that's also probably no surprise, is that the decrease has slowed down in the recent months. And I guess we will see that it will remain on a historical record level during the whole winter and the spring 2021 probably as well. So what we have seen is that we had a bit more relaxed COVID summer. I guess it was the same in Romania. But we are now seeing a sharp rise of the infection rates, which then, of course, hits on the economy, because our lockdown and the appetite to consume and make investments is impacted. So we will have a tough fall and winter, with Kurzarbeit still being in high demand, I guess.
Andrada, do we have an idea formed about the efficiency of Kurzarbeit in Romania already?
This program has been introduced in August 2020, and reasonably speaking, considering the provisions of the law, it could only be applied starting with September. What we know is that the unemployment rate in Romania was of 5.3% in August, decreased by 0.1% in September, and increased once again by 0.2% in October. These are the latest public information that are available. Whether these figures are due to the ease of restrictions in most of the business areas during summertime or due to this program, it is very hard to say. Overall, there is an obvious yearly increase and a slight decrease in September. There has been another decrease in August of 0.1% as well, which makes the assessment very difficult. We'll have to wait a bit more and see, considering also the future impact of the relevant changes we've mentioned before.
Andreas, based on your experience, what are the disadvantages of Kurzarbeit? Can we find this kind of points of critics?
Yes, I guess with any government program, there's quite a few points that are being criticized, and there is room for improvement. So quick walk through the main concerns and complaints. So from the employer side, the administrative burden is, there are complaints about that. I mentioned that, you have to maintain timesheets, you have to complete a form. So there is no doubt there is an administrative burden. I wouldn't consider it overly over the top compared to what we do in other areas. We love bureaucracy in Germany, and I guess there is administration also here, so that could be improved. But I'm always in favor of reducing administration. But of course, there has been a drive to be very quick in approving Kurzarbeit applications, and that, on the other hand, and that's another point of complaint, has resulted in significant abuse and fraud connected with Kurzarbeit. So our Federal Employment Agency has discovered about 1.5 million of Kurzarbeit benefits paid without legitimacy or paid as a result of fraud. That's almost nothing if you consider the amount that was actually spent. But it's not the whole truth, because our agency is massively understaffed, or obviously particular in COVID times, with many employees working from home or being sick. So the estimates are that there's about 200 to 300 million euros of fraud in connection with Kurzarbeit. And that compares to about 19 billion euros spent in total in 2020. So there is fraud, as probably with any governmental subsidy program. Whether it's massive or unbearable is a different question, looking at the positive impacts we do see. The 19 billion, obviously, that's another point of critics. It's too expensive. I mean, that doesn't really convince. If it's very easy to do the math. If as the alternative to paying somebody 60 or 67% of the money they lost as a result of Kurzarbeit, it's obviously cheaper than paying the same money, not only on the reduced working time, but completely on their salary as unemployment benefits. So unemployment is always more expensive than short-time work. I'm not saying that of the 7 million people in Kurzarbeit, all would have been unemployed without Kurzarbeit. But it's even if sort of a significant percentage of people in Kurzarbeit would have been made redundant instead, or made redundant earlier, this puts into relation the 19 billion. It's expensive, but the alternative is more expensive. And I think the final, I would say, and to me, I think to some extent valid point of criticism is that, we do restrict the functioning of the market in a way. What's called the creative power of destruction of the market is sort of restricted. And there are people who say that we are artificially extending the life cycle of industries and companies which are already doomed and which are not competitive. So I guess that's a valid point for any long-term ordinary course of business subsidies. It's probably not so valid in connection with COVID, where it's really a clear situation to everybody that businesses have been massively impacted by an event which none of us could foresee and which is not related to our businesses being not able to compete on the market. Just look at Lufthansa, which is or was one of the most healthy airlines, national airlines on the world, and would have been insolvent many times already now without Kurzarbeit and other direct investment by the state. And I would argue that this is not, a creative power of destruction. I think it's a valid point for a government to save healthy companies like Lufthansa in special situations through Kurzarbeit and other tools. So I guess those were the points of potential criticism.
Andrada and Andreas, are there any other European systems, applying successfully this program?
The most known and successful example is, of course, Germany. There are many countries adopting or adapting similar systems under COVID-19 circumstances. It's ERTE in Spain, Ordinary Wage Guarantee Fund, or the Wage Integration Fund in Italy, Chômage Partiel in France, or job retention schemes in the UK. They all have in common the fact that the state covers a fair high fraction of the salary the workers affected by a total or partial reduction in their work no longer received, and they are all relatively long-lasting. Unfortunately, some of these programs are close to coming to an end, and even if they are most effective temporary, namely on the short run, and also bring disadvantages if extended for longer than necessary, the economies are set to stall during the upcoming period as new COVID-19 restrictions and lockdowns in various EU countries are imposed. The contraction all over the world is expected to be even higher than initially predicted. So the governments need to continue to respond through these types of programs as well.
Yeah, I fully agree with that, Andrada. I think it's for a good reason that we see this EU, probably even other parts of the world. Within the EU, we see this trend to use Kurzarbeit as a tool. If you look at and you've addressed it a bit already, Andrada. If you look at the terms and conditions, the same ideas nevertheless differ then in detail quite a bit. So if we just look at the level of benefits, Germany is actually quite low, on the lower end of the programs currently in place in Europe. If you compare it to up to 100% in Ireland, the Scandinavics, up to 80% in Austria, UK and Italy. So the thing is that doesn't necessarily show you how effective and successful a program is, because there's more than one criteria to determine how it works together. I guess we have to look beyond just introducing Kurzarbeit. It has to fit into the toolbox that the government has installed, and where it all works together, I guess we can see the positive impact as you've described, Andrada. So I guess we, going forward, I hope COVID is done with soon and we are over that. But there will be other crises, and I guess the toolbox, which Romania is using and other EU states are using, it's good we have it, because there will be need, no doubt, for the future.
Exactly.
As COVID has shown us, there's always a special situation and you need to adopt tailored measures. I guess we will see that in the future.
Andreas, Andrada, thank you for your answers. And it is easier now to understand this concept, a standing concept in Germany with its advantages and also with its disadvantages. Thank you.
Thank you.